It's Ken Harbaugh with Against All Enemies on the MeidasTouch Network. This is a clip of former President Trump at a recent campaign stop in Texas, surrounded by a sea of uniforms. The crowd is full of members of the National Guard and Texas Highway Patrol officers posing for pictures with the former president. In normal political times, I wouldn't be too bothered by this. Presidential candidates have every right to appear with members of the military and law enforcement. These, however, are not normal times, and there is something increasingly ominous about the way Donald Trump's campaign is attracting military and law enforcement personnel. We know he doesn't actually respect the military. He called dead American service members suckers and losers. He's using them to get elected and for far worse. He already tried in his first term to invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy the U.S. military against American civilians. And we know from reporting about the 2025 project that he likely has every intention of doing so again. I spoke with Mike Breen, Army combat vet and CEO of Human Rights First, about this. So, Mike, great to have you back on Against All Enemies. It's been a couple of weeks. Would love your reaction to that video, because on the surface, I don't think there's anything wrong with a presidential candidate meeting with troops, and it looks like law enforcement officers. But I think we need to start bracing ourselves for this rollout of false patriotism and using troops as props for what is going to be, I think, a pretty awful presidential campaign. But what was your gut reaction?
Yeah, I think that's right, Ken. There's the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. There's nothing wrong with a presidential candidate meeting with National Guardsmen and women and members of law enforcement. Right, that's fine. But when that same presidential candidate used his Veterans Day speech to talk about rooting out vermin, and he's talking about our fellow Americans with political views that he doesn't share, and when he's talking about weaponizing the Department of Justice against his political enemies, and he's openly talking about internment camps because immigrants, to use his words, poison the blood of the country, and he's openly discussed throwing the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in prison for defying him politically. It takes on a very different tone. And this is a former president who's made a major piece of his politics pardoning, war criminals for murders in war zones and violations of codes of conduct that I know you and I both find sacred. So it takes on a very, very different tone when that's the candidate and that's the track record.
We're both vets, and it still baffles me that our brothers and sisters in arms don't understand the disdain with which this president holds our service. People who we should be able to trust, John Kelly, Mark Milley, and others, have talked about the president's scorn for wounded vets, saying that they shouldn't appear at any of his events, calling veterans suckers and losers. And yet, as you well know, there are a lot of our buddies who still flock to his side, who still pose for pictures. Do you have a simple explanation for that?
I don't know if there's a simple explanation for it, but I think it has a lot to do with, we got to have an honest reckoning about the last 20 years. These people we're talking about are brothers and sisters, people we served with. We served with them. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan as an Army officer, right? But wherever in the world you served, we just spent 20 years fighting wars that didn't make a lot of sense to a lot of the people fighting them, that went on for over a generation. Fathers and sons doing tours in the same places, in the same provinces, and that ended, really tragically, and in a way that I think left a lot of moral injury, especially the total collapse of Afghanistan and the evacuation effort that followed. So that leaves people, I think, very understandably open to arguments that the system is broken and that the system has betrayed them and that they've been lied to and abused by elites. And we got to grapple with that. We got to do a much better job grappling with that as a country. You can't just whistle past the graveyard and pretend none of that ever happened. And I think, it's incumbent on the political and foreign policy establishments to be a little bit more forward into that conversation. Um, it's a hard thing, but I don't think there's any way around it.
If this isn't history repeating itself, I don't know what is, because every time there is that widespread social disillusionment, especially among veterans, I can point to 2 or 3 case studies of this. The solution, the bearer of the solution, the person who comes along who says, "I will be your vengeance," turns out every time to be a charlatan, a false prophet. You look at Mussolini. More recently, you look at al-Zarqawi. You look at all of these cases of people preying on the kind of disillusionment you're talking about, particularly among veterans who have paid a very high price for being left behind. And those people who purport to speak for them always let them down.
Every damn time. And it's the same conspiracy theory type stuff every time too. You never lost on the battlefield, but you were defeated anyway. Why? It must be you must have been stabbed in the back by your own somehow, right? And we saw this in Germany after World War One with consequences everybody knows about, but it happens a lot. That same narrative, happened in the United States after Vietnam. The idea that the left had stabbed the troops in the back, and we're seeing it again now. And I think the only solution to that is a more honest conversation from the rest of us. You can't just pretend that none of this ever happened and not grapple with it. And there's always this desire in the media and political worlds to move on from a thing. 2 years ago feels like ancient history when you talk about the end of the Afghanistan conflict, but you can't just turn the page on 22 years of this stuff for the people who fought these wars. I know, as I know you do, I've got friends who, I spent something like 28 months in combat, but that's nothing compared. I've got friends who spent years and years and years of their lives, deployment after deployment, 20 years careers, with 12 of those years deployed. And you think about what that does to somebody when it turns out that they were fighting a war everybody else kind of forgot about, and in the end just sort of walked away from. They're going to be looking for something to give them a way to go forward. And in this case, it's a con man.
If you're like me, morning coffee is non-negotiable, but I was tired of either waiting in line for an overpriced cup or settling for gritty, bitter coffee at home. Now, I've switched to using AeroPress, and I'm never going back. It's so easy and convenient and unique. I never knew coffee at home could taste this good. AeroPress is like a French press, only better. It's the only press that uses a patented 3-in-1 brew technology, combining the best of several brew methods into one portable device for a completely unique and delicious flavor profile. Smooth, rich, and full-bodied, without the bitterness and grit found in other presses. And as a bonus, AeroPress can brew thousands of recipes. AeroPress travels better than others too. It's compact and incredibly durable. That means you'll never have to endure terrible coffee at the hotel, on the job, or on an adventure again. It brews and cleans in less than 2 minutes. Just add medium-fine coffee grounds, pour in hot water, stir for 5 seconds, brew for 30 seconds, then press into your favorite mug and enjoy. There's a reason why AeroPress is the barista's favorite home brewing tool. AeroPress is the best-reviewed coffee press on the planet, with more than 55,000 5-star reviews. Thoughtful, proven, and under $50, AeroPress is the perfect gift or stocking stuffer for every coffee lover in your life this holiday season. Don't settle for less than the best. They'll love it. AeroPress is shockingly affordable, less than $50, and we've got an incredible offer for our audience. Visit aeropress.com/boats. That's AEROPRESS.com/boats and save up to 20%. That's aeropress.com/boats to save up to 20%. It's time to ditch the drive-thru, toss the French press, and say yes to better mornings fueled by better coffee. AeroPress ships to the USA and over 60 countries around the world, and we thank AeroPress for sponsoring our show. Thanks for listening, everyone. I've got a quick break here, but I need a favor first. Shows like this depend on your support. Please, if you can spare 5 seconds, click the link to the podcast version of the show below and leave us a 5-star review. It really does help. Thanks. You used the term moral injury before. Can you explain that to the layperson? I think most people know what PTSD is. Moral injury is different. In some ways, it's even more insidious because it's not as often talked about.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm not a professional, so I'll do my best to explain it. But essentially, it's an injury of the soul. It's different from your brain experiencing trauma. And most people who go into combat, almost everybody who does, the truth is going to come out with some form of PTSD or another. I mean, almost everyone. That's just the nature of combat. But beyond that, the exposure to danger, the exposure to death, the exposure to trauma, to fear. Beyond that is the question of, what's my identity as a person, and did my actions, did my service line up with my sense of who I am as a moral being, right? And when those two things don't line up, when your society's asked you to go do things that you have a really hard time living with at some level. And I'm not talking about war crimes. I'm talking about being part of something, giving your heart and soul to something that turns out to not have been worth it. That'll start to eat your soul. And I think there's just a lot of that in this generation of vets. There's a lot of that in our comrades.
I think it is a helpful explanation, partial explanation for why so many, not a majority, but by far too many of our fellow vets seek out groups like the Oath Keepers and Three Percenters and Proud Boys to regain that sense of purpose, to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. They're contributing to a greater cause.
Yeah, and they get the message too. Look, it wasn't your fault. It's not your fault that it ended this way. And that part is right. It's not their fault. It's not their fault. There's nothing else we could have asked of our military for the last 20 years. Nothing else we could have asked of the people we serve with, right? Did everything that was asked of them and more. And it really isn't their fault. But to then ask them to sign up for a toxic cause, to go, lie to them and tell them, hey, and the solution to this is to go destroy the thing that you set out to defend because it's all rotten to the core. I mean, we all know who that serves. And it's funny. You look at the guys leading this movement, and they're almost all guys. You look at the Donald Trumps, sure, but the image that sticks with me every time is Josh Hawley, right? Here's a guy. This guy is never going to be on the front lines of anything. Never served a day in his life. Fist bumping the crowd on Jan 6 and then turning his back and running away, right? And he's nowhere to be found when things get tough. These are the guys leading the movement. They have nothing to offer any of these guys, and they can't even really look them in the eye in terms of being honorable men and women. They're just using them, and it's a hell of a shame. I mean, I think you got to be accountable for your decisions. You got to be accountable for the choices you make, especially when those choices involve breaking the law and attacking federal buildings and signing up with armed militias. But it is really heartbreaking that these lies have taken in so many people who've already given so much to the country.
And it is striking how people like the former president, Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, and others hold their most ardent followers in such contempt. They would never be caught dead at the same cocktail party, right? They are using the passion of these followers for their own political ends.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. When they're not writing books on masculinity, when in between champagne brunches, right? I mean, it's the whole thing is absurd. But here we are.
Yeah. I am sure you have seen some of the recent reporting about Project 2025. I want to get your thoughts on that before we wrap up. It's this blueprint by the Heritage Foundation to entrench President Trump's hold on power should he win the next election, even more deeply than before, to rout out the deep state. I mean, you can just borrow from his own speeches. One of the most alarming aspects of this plan is to invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy the U.S. military against American civilians to put down protests. And I'm sure the kind of protests they have in mind are things like the Women's March, which embarrassed and to some degree disrupted the opening weeks of President Trump's first term in office. what are your thoughts about Project 2025, and I mean, how would that unfold? The 82nd Airborne squaring off against American civilians in the streets of Washington D.C.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nightmare scenario, right? And this is the striking thing is I get, and I have to look at the media on this. You know, you and some others being the shining exception of this. We have essentially the destruction of American democracy being laid out in detail in the open by a presidential candidate in speech after speech, by think tanks that support him. Plan to take what is it, 54,000 federal employees, wipe them off the map, and replace them with an army of loyalists. Use the military against peaceful American protesters. I mean, this is dystopian nightmare, fascist takeover stuff, right? Except it's real. It's being put in print. It's being spoken of at the podium. It's being used to rally electoral support. And I look at the press and I still see horse race coverage and detailed coverage of his trials and things like that. Like, we're not facing, essentially an open attempt to destroy American democracy as we know it. But that's what this is. And I could sit here and talk, and we should, about the nightmare that this would be for the military. An American military ordered into the streets against its own civilians, something that generations of military leaders have done everything in their power to avoid, something that General Milley, got way too close to and backed away in horror, right? I mean, we thought we might see this after George Floyd's murder. There was talk of the 82nd, and we walked right up to the brink of a total nightmare, right? And it was already bad enough. You remember those pictures of National Guardsmen, in full battle rattle on the steps of the Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial with face mask covering. That's not the relationship we ought to have with the military. That's not what America's Army's relationship with its democratic neighbors ought to be, right? We talk about citizen soldiers. It doesn't look very much like a citizen soldier to me. But that's the least of it. I mean, the loss of 250 years of almost entirely apolitical service by the armed forces to this democracy is the least of it. We're talking about a complete change in who we are as a country. And, it's really hard to understand where we go from there if they're able to do this. I think they'll encounter a lot of resistance, but I don't know how much, and I don't know how that goes, but it looks like the breaking of a lot of things that took 250 years to put together. And once you lose them, as we've both seen in country after country around the world, there's no limit to how far down you can go once you start down that road.
Well, we will keep sounding the alarm. Thanks, Mike, for helping us out. We'll have you back here soon. Appreciate your time.
You too, Ken. Thank you.